Welcome back to PR After Hours. I'm your host, Alex Greenwood, bringing you your weekly cocktail of PR and marketing tips that will help you and your business. Hey, we'll be right back just after these messages. Hello, listeners. It's me, Alex, from PR After Hours. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. And I wanted to talk to you just for a moment about the way I get this show right into your earbuds every week. It's because I use Anchor FM. Now, I've told you previously that I've been podcasting since 2006, back when we used stone knives and bear skins and a couple of Dixie cups and string. Anchor FM has really streamlined this and made it simpler for people who don't know the first thing about setting up a podcast or don't have, time to learn all the pro tools and stuff, because it's all right here. First thing it's important to know is it's free. There are certain tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. That's huge. Distribution is a big pain in the butt, to be honest with you, so it's really great Anchor FM can do that for you, and you're not paying hosting fees. That adds up every month. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place, so download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started, and be sure to join me in the virtual cocktail lounge on PR After Hours. It's a bit of a sad commentary on our society that in the past few years, and particularly since the pandemic hit, a lot of Americans have created their own reality. The call of fake news to things they disagree with, the virtual inability to agree on a basic set of facts. It's really harmful to our society. And of course, it plays a huge role in how public relations and marketing folks do their jobs. Part of this is due to what's known as cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is a system and a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality and judgment. Individuals create their own subjective reality from their perception of the input. So an individual's construction of reality, not the objective input, may dictate their behavior in the world. A quick example of that would be zero-sum bias. That's I win, you lose. This is why it's hard to teach kids to share their toys instead of hogging all the playthings, right? Or why does your neighbor's dog bark so aggressively whenever you approach, chasing you off the edge of their lawn? Why do lions stand guard over freshly killed prey to deter any other predators from getting at it? The answer is zero-sum bias. Now, this is academy4sc.org has this wonderful little example of this here, and I'm quoting from. Every animal, including humans, is wired with the belief that all the resources in their environment come in limited supply. Thus, whenever another creature takes a unit of that limited supply for themselves, whether it's a toy, land, or piece of meat they've killed, that means there is one less unit of that resource available to you, making the odds more difficult for you to survive. Due to this instinctive belief that there is constant competition for resources, babies, pet dogs, and lions alike are quite aggressive when it comes to claiming possessions for themselves. I could just hear my daughter when she was little, mine, if you just take it and want to play with something, mine. It's normal, it's built in, and it's not great. So when you think about that and what's going on in the world today, there's cognitive bias during a crisis. Now, you knew I was going to get to crisis eventually, didn't you? I found this very good article by Julie Wright on Reagan's PR Daily. And of course, remember, everything I refer to is linked in the show notes. You know, I always tell you when I am quoting or riffing on something, I'm never just taking it. So I want to make sure we're clear on that. Just check the show notes. But in this article, she is talking about 5 ways to mitigate and avoid cognitive bias in times of crisis. And she goes through a lot of it, and again, as I'm prone to do when I quote from someone else's piece, I may lift a few bits here and there to talk about, but the whole thing is really worth you going back and reading at the link I provide. First thing she says is research and test your messages. And at the heart of every good communication strategy and crisis plan is a messaging platform. Key messages are used to help drive the beliefs, motivations, and behaviors of an organization's target audiences and stakeholders. She's right about that. And She goes on and talks about how messaging can target employees, customers, regulators, and communities. And in all those cases, your message needs to be based on research that gives emotional insights into the target audience. This avoids your own bias clouding your communications and helps you identify your target audience's cognitive bias to which you might be able to adapt your messaging. The framing bias could be used to set context in your messaging. For example, emphasizing a huge number of upfront for buying a product or describing an infection rate makes the subsequently shared actual price or infection rate seem smaller. The reverse, of course, is true as well. So framing is very important, and she goes into more depth there or detail there. But then you've got to acknowledge that cognitive bias exists, and that's another important thing. She mentions how normalcy bias has compelled many leaders to minimize the threat of the coronavirus with statements like it's, quote, it's business as usual, unquote, or, quote, it's important to get students back to the classroom this fall, unquote. Normalcy bias minimizes threat warnings and downplays disaster and its impacts. In a public health emergency, she says, exhibiting normalcy bias in messaging erodes a leader's or brand's credibility and potentially endangers employees, customers, or students by undermining safety precautions or prudent planning. I'm not going to beat that one to death. It's obvious that's what's happening. We, particularly those of us who are representing organizations that are customer facing or have health related services or products, we need to be very sure about this. Basically what we're saying here is, you know what, we all want this to go away. And maybe if we, with human nature, we just kind of wish it away by saying, well, it's football season, therefore virus or no, we're going to all go to the game. Yeah, we can all go to the game. We can all do what we did the Sturgis Rally. 200 or more than 250,000 people went there. Or it was like 400,000 people went to this big rally for motorcycles. And now there's a study showing that 260,000 cases may very well spring up from this. I mean, so that's the danger of that. When you normalize things and say, oh, it's not so bad, or it's fake news, that's a problem. She goes on. She says, equip yourself with tools like a crisis plan, evaluation criteria, scoring matrices, and even the tried and true checklist, which can enforce the discipline needed to ensure objective and reasoned decisions and avoid cognitive traps, particularly in a crisis. She mentions airline pilots and surgeons use checklists to ensure bias is kept out of their decision making. Like for pilots, a heuristic of aviate, navigate, communicate is taught early. So there's that. There's more about that in the article, of course. Surround yourself with multiple viewpoints. A diversity of insights and information sources helps to reduce bias. It is so important to have boardroom diversity. It's an indicator of higher corporate performance. She mentions a report by McKinsey studied the board comp and returns on equity and margins on earnings before interest and taxes of 180 publicly traded companies in 4 countries over 2 years. They found startlingly consistent results. For companies ranking in the top quartile of executive board diversity, ROEs were 53% higher on average than they were for those in the bottom quartile. At the same time, EBIT margins at the most diverse companies were 14% higher on average than those of the least diverse companies. It's not even a feel good. It's not a PR thing to have a diverse board or a diverse management team or a diverse workforce. It simply helps you navigate through this world because guess what? Your board, it could be all of one ethnicity or all of one thought process, but the world is not of one ethnicity, one thought process, one belief system. Diversity is a strength. Next, she says, learn to spot common cognitive biases. And these are fascinating. And I wish we had time to go through all of them, but I'm just going to kind of touch on the one she mentions. There's anchoring bias, which refers to using previous information as a reference point, which can skew decision-making processes. So putting the original full price next to the markdown anchors our original perception of value as being the full price, right? You see that all the time. You go to CVS, they're real big on that. You go to Target, you go wherever you go. So the sale price looks like a steal, but what if the wholesale cost of the item was first shown? The sale price wouldn't look so appealing. That's so great. Self-serving bias, it helps soften the blow to the ego when we make a poor decision by attributing it to poor luck. I've been there. Years ago, won't say who, but I did buy into a franchising marketing system. It's a franchise marketing system. And I just thought, this is great. I can sell this to my clients, my existing PR clients. I can expand my marketing. I can my marketing offerings, all these things. What I failed to do was really research how well this would go over. Would my clients be willing to be upsold on this? Could I sell this in a market that's already crowded with people selling the same thing? Well, the answer was no. And it was a very expensive lesson. And I got to tell you, I had some self-serving bias for a long time, especially when I was repaying the debt I built up. buying this franchise option. And I just kept saying, oh, it was bad luck, this, that. And then I finally realized, no, it wasn't bad luck. You did not research it properly. The market was resistant to it. Nobody viewed you, Alex, and your company as a marketing firm. They viewed you as a PR and marketing consultancy, but you were not strictly the guy or the agency they thought of when it came to marketing. Some did, but mostly they thought of PR with marketing around the fringe, so to speak, with what we did. And that's fair. So I had to live down self-serving bias in that case. Herd mentality is another one. She's right. As social creatures, it's hard to fight it. When there's a consensus or a growing trend or fad, our gut is to move in the same direction as the herd. I heard it said elsewhere, it's courageous to not be part of the herd. It's so much easier, though, to be part of it. It's just so much easier. For example, our gym situation during COVID. I belong to a kickboxing gym, and it's a tight quarters. And for the longest time, the first couple of months of this thing, I was scared to death of going to the gym. It was packed. There's all these people in a very tight area. And I just thought for a while there, I had 1 or 2 days after 2 months of being tired of not being able to go to the gym. I thought, well, shoot, everybody else is doing it. Everybody seems to be fine. I should go. And I literally was almost getting ready to go to this gym when I realized, whoa. Just because you see online that all these other folks are going, just because you haven't heard yet that somebody's been infected by going to a tiny gym, cheek to jowl with other people, breathing heavily, doesn't mean necessarily that you're safe. I almost succumbed to herd mentality. I did find opportunities to go there once the gym started instituting appointment only, where you had to make an appointment and there was a relatively small number of people at the gym. And that way you weren't there packed in with 20 other people. You could be there with just a few other people at a safe distance with proper cleaning, proper air filtration, all the things that make it safer, but not absolutely safe as staying home, of course. But we're not talking about managing risk in this discussion. But the point being, I almost gave into the herd mentality. And it was only until the gym started moving closer to the things that I thought were safer and made it more sense for me to go that I even considered it and did so. So herd mentality is a very powerful force. Loss aversion is another one. She talks about how avoiding a loss is a greater motivator than gaining a reward, which could also be about me going to the gym, I guess. This can lead to missed opportunities driven by risk aversion. You can see it on game shows when contestants settle for the cash they've earned. Monty, I'll take door number 2. Yeah, I will not trade it for what's behind door number 3, that kind of thing. Or in organizational cultures where the mentality of keeping one's head down and analyzing things to death. The analysis paralysis, ring a bell, anybody? Before an eventual decision by a committee is the safer route than the perceived riskier route of decisiveness and efficiency. Back when I was a vice president of a TV station, a local public TV station here in my city, 11, 12 years ago, I saw podcasting as the next wave of the future, believe it or not. And I said, look, we should go ahead and start offering podcast recordings on our website. It's a value add. It'll be fun. I had to explain to everybody what podcasting was. I had to convince the engineers to strip the audio out of videotapes of shows that we did, local shows, and nobody wanted to do it. And it was a big slog, but guess what now? Yeah, I don't even need to go further, do I? Podcasting is huge. In fact, podcasting is a very, especially for a TV station, expensive way to create new content to get new viewers. So I was right about that. But at the time, there was a lot of resistance bias going on. That's not the way we've done things before, that kind of thing. Why would we do this? It's extra work. Here's a favorite of mine, the Dunning-Kruger effect. This effect describes poor performers who greatly overestimate their abilities. Put another way, it applies to people who lack the competence to evaluate their own abilities. There's a great book by Tom Nichols called The Death of Expertise. It's really all about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Particularly with social media, everybody thinks because they have a way to put their opinion out there that it certainly must be right. And I want to tell you something. I am the first one to say I am an expert at 1 or 2 things. And when I say an expert, I mean I have enough expertise to spout off about it or to be asked about it, to be interviewed about it, or to be consulted about it or hired about it. The rest of it, I may have a smattering of knowledge, but I don't know. I'm not an epidemiologist. All I can do is correlate information I can read and hear from epidemiologists to determine how I should behave during this pandemic, even though that's confusing as hell, frankly, because of a lot of forces. But I think there's so many people who Speaking of like punditry, because Tom Nichols is a pundit, he even said this himself. He's like, it's very tempting when they're brought on to talk about, let's say, the presidency, to be asked about other related things, politically related, like to be asked about the presidency, and then they start asking about COVID, for example. Well, he's not a doctor. He can talk about the presidency and the president's reaction to COVID, but he has no business talking about epidemiology and how viruses work and that kind of thing. So you have that Dunning-Kruger effect where it can creep up on you. Even the most well-intentioned people, most people are well-intentioned, but it's to overcome it. You need to recognize your shortcomings. You need to make sure the people that work with you report to you, even the people, if you're in a board situation, can recognize those shortcomings. If you can grow their competence, that's great. But basically, you're not going to make people experts overnight on stuff that's just not in their bailiwick. I think it's huge when somebody I respect, and I've seen this more than once in my career, but whether it be CEOs, I've seen a few CEOs do this, or presidents, I've seen politicians I've worked with do this. I've seen some really competent people, even doctors, believe it or not, say, that's not my specialty. I don't know. I would be remiss if I were to comment. One more example, that I went to my general practitioner for a checkup a few months ago, and I was very scared about COVID, and I had all these questions. I said, what do I do? I got a family. What's going to happen if I do this? And he just looked at me and said, I don't know. And I was stunned by this. He says, I'll tell you what I do based on being a physician, a general practice physician, based on what I know, the people I speak with, what I read, I do this, this, and this. And I could not have been more terrified by that at first, but I could not have been more appreciative last that he was honest with me and he didn't try to fake it. He told me, these are what the things that I'm doing. I recommend you do these. I recommend you probably don't do this. But he told me one thing. He says, Alex, you got to remember something. You got to live your life. This is a dangerous time, but he says you can't live sealed up in your house all the time. You've got to judiciously take some risks. So I just really appreciated the fact that he was confident enough in who he was and respectful enough of me to tell me what he did and did not know. And I'm telling you, by the way, when you're working with the news media, I don't know is an answer they don't get very often, but it seems like they're refreshed by it. My answer in the middle of a press conference or an interview or a call or even over the social media from a reporter or an interested party saying, well, what do you think of this? Or what does this mean? Blah, blah, blah. And if I don't know, I'll say, I don't know, but I'll get back to you after I research it. It's a great answer because it's the truth. You don't know, but you want to help. Narrative fallacy, that's like a framing bias. It appeals to our love of a good story. So when the story's too good to resist, we get drawn in. The ancient Greeks, I think, is something we've been doing since before the ancient Greeks. She said, explain this sunrise and sunset as the god Helios pulling the sun across the sky in his golden chariot. So she says, fight the urge to impose narratives where no real connection exists and look instead at what the data says. There's an old, really old political saw President Reagan had used about a welfare queen, I'm putting that in quotes, who had numerous Cadillacs, and I believe she had like 80 different aliases or something like that. I mean, just an extraordinarily large amount of aliases to get welfare, and she was making $150,000 a year off the welfare system. Well, no, the real case was that there was a person who had 8 aliases, and she made a grand total of about $7,000 or $8,000 off welfare. But the story got good, and the response to the story got good. When I say good for him and what he was trying to do to be elected president, and it just became a bigger and bigger thing. Well, it wasn't true. It had some minor basis in fact, but it wasn't true. It's very easy to get a juicy story going, and people get excited about that story, and you just kind of embroider it. Another example, Brian Williams, NBC. He was the NBC nightly news anchor. He'd get pulled into talk shows, and he would just start embroidering how close he was, his proximity to danger, and all these things. And the anecdotes he kept building on and embroidering had no real basis. In fact, he was just adding things on because it made a good story, and it just wasn't true what he was saying. At the very least, there was a kernel of truth, but the story just got bigger and bigger and bigger. We all do this, but it's a fallacy. It's a narrative. Hindsight bias, statements like "I knew it all along" is hindsight bias. She says. Last thing she's talking about is being mindful. She says to avoid cognitive bias at decision junctures, and particularly in times of crisis, be sure you're continuing to research and test your communications. And she just goes on with it. And I'll just finish up by saying this is all should be part and parcel of your crisis communication planning. And it should be a part of your actual, just your general communication strategy. You should be trying to poke holes at areas where you have these biases. You should be kind of the skunk in the garden party, because you're going to be the one who's going to have to go in times when they're not a crisis. saying, boss, I've explored this, or board members, I've explored this, I've looked at this. Here are some potential windows of danger we have because of our cognitive biases. And you're not pointing a finger like, you're bad or you did something wrong. It's just, these are some areas we need to tune up. So I know this has been kind of a long one here, but I get really excited talking about stuff like this. And I think it's very important for PR professionals in particular to identify and avoid this kind of stuff, especially during a crisis. So again, thanks to Julie Wright, quoted in Reagan's PR Daily. I will put a link in the show notes. Oh, you know what that means? Looks like it's last call here at your virtual lounge for PR news, views, and interviews. Don't forget, you can ask me a question anytime. You can do it through our Twitter account, which is @HoursPR, or even better, you can send me a message vocally. I would love to hear your voice, and I'll answer it on the show. There's a link in the show notes. All you have to do is sign up through Anchor FM. It's free, doesn't take long. And you record your message, I get the message, I will play your audio, just give me your first name and the city you live in, and then I will answer the question to the best of my ability right here on the show. Don't forget to, if you're enjoying this podcast, you can support it and help increase the frequency and value of the show. Just consider being a sponsor for your brand or your agency or just yourself because you're like, I like this show. Or just drop a few coins in the virtual tip jar. Either way, there's links in the show notes. Please check that out. All of that, of course, being in the show notes where you're listening right now or at prafterhours.com. I see that they're turning up the lights. Last call is over, and I've got to clean up this virtual lounge. And until next time, I'm Alex Greenwood, and you've been listening to PR After Hours on Anchor FM.